Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be with you here at the National Press Club for the launch of the Freedom of the Media Initiative. Thank you to the Transatlantic Leadership Network for this invitation and, of course, for the opportunity to talk a little bit here tonight about the challenges facing journalists in the age of fake news. I'm Ghida Fakhry, host and managing editor of two of TRT World's political programs from Washington, D.C., and moderator of the Doha debates. Now, as a journalist based here in D.C., in fact, just a few blocks away, there probably isn't a more timely or appropriate topic than, dare I say, fake news. Since I've been here for the past 4 years, it has become an almost inescapable buzzword. But the word itself is, and that is part of the problem, a misnomer. It confuses and it confounds two concepts, because if it is fake, then it isn't real, it isn't news. If it is news, it's not fake. Go figure. It's imaginary, invented, and often amplified. And there is the problem, the danger. Well, so much for semantics, though. Unfortunately, this pernicious expression has now entered the political jargon. It's become almost part of our daily lives, whether we like it or not. So I am compelled to use it more than I would like to here tonight. Fake news per se is hardly a new phenomenon, of course. What is relatively new, though, is the vehicle, the vectors of its propagation, the internet, social media, the powerful algorithms and troll farms that we're all, sadly, all too familiar with. It's a dire reality of the social media world we all inhabit. It has become not just a novel kind of propaganda, it is increasingly being used to attack, to sow discord, to undermine society's trust in what we do in news reporting. It is troubling, of course, to see the way it has been utilized by many politicians, not just here in the United States, but right across the world, the way it's been weaponized to sow distrust, to undermine the integrity of journalists. But again, that's nothing new. Fake news is not just an offshoot of social media. Fabricated or inaccurate or manipulated news has always been around. Old-fashioned propaganda. We've lived with it for as long as we can remember. But the difference is that we are entering an era where it's becoming more and more difficult to discern truth from fiction. And there's the velocity with which fake news spreads directly to consumers, to the citizenry around the world, the millions of people who rely on digital platforms for their information every single day. And it spreads so fast, almost like wildfire, that it hardly leaves us time to test it. That is what separates today's fake news from good old-fashioned propaganda, because on this side of the Atlantic, for too long, propaganda had long meant that it was government-manipulated information, typically that came out of Nazi Germany, the Soviet bloc, or any other communist or socialist country. But I suppose, as in the words of one wise Secretary General of the United Nations, whom I covered for many years, where you stand depends on where you sit. I was amused, in fact, not too long ago to discover and to learn that Radio Free Europe, remember? Radio Free Europe, or Radio Liberty as it's known as well, which was founded and funded by the US government since 1949, at the beginning of the Cold War, to broadcast its message across the Iron Curtain. Well, it's still alive, and well, it's still beaming to the world as we speak. So politicians, essentially in liberal or illiberal democracies, not to mention dictatorships, of course, have always attempted to manipulate, even distort the truth to advance their own political vested interests and aims. It isn't just a Trump phenomenon. And I say this because the former president, as we all know, has taken credit for popularizing the term, well, even for inventing it. I remember reading that he actually spoke to a New York Times reporter back in 2019 saying, quote, "More and more people are declaring fake news. I see it in so many countries. I think I was the one that started using it." Well, granted, I think he was. At least, one could argue, he made it blunter because he was pretty much the first head of state who utilized social media and Twitter, of course, to conduct policy and diplomacy. It has now become commonplace. So many people are doing the same thing. It's potentially very dangerous, but for several other reasons that we won't have time to get into tonight. Needless to say that whatever the origins of the term and the concept. Trump certainly used it more than anyone else during the presidential campaign, and in fact, when he settled into the White House, hundreds of times by the time he'd left office. He gave it so much traction that Collins Dictionary felt compelled during his first year in office in 2017 to call fake news the ultimate word of the year. In fact, studies that have been conducted in the years since have shown that falsehoods are 70 times, or I should say 70%, more likely to be retweeted or shared than truths. And they are 6 times faster at reaching people, especially when it comes to political news. Attacks by politicians in the US on the media worked in riling up the base against journalists who were targeted as being unfair, those who were calling out the quote-unquote big lie. Studies have also shown, though, that it has worked because 50 million Republicans, after the insurrection of January 6th, actually believe that the election was stolen. So Trump succeeded in what he was trying to do, even if it was at the cost, some might argue, of American democracy. But he also did damage much further afield. He emboldened other leaders, foreign autocrats, of course, dictators who censor, threaten, and jail journalists. All they needed to do is shout fake news to justify their suppression of any independent scrutiny of their actions and policies. If the leader of the free world himself could do it and get away with it, well, so could they, and they would take advantage of it. Not that they needed much encouragement to begin with. When an American president, of course, calls the media the enemy of the people and portrays himself as the victim of unfair, inaccurate reporting, it is seriously worrisome for journalists everywhere. It was therefore no coincidence that this year the Nobel Committee decided to bestow its greatest honor, the Peace Prize, on 2 journalists, Maria Ressa and Dmitry Muratov, for, quote, their efforts and courageous fight for freedom of expression, which the committee said was a precondition for democracy and lasting peace. The Nobel Committee highlighted Maria Ressa's work, especially in documenting just how social media was being used to spread fake news, to harass opponents, to manipulate public discourse. She herself likened it to a virus of lies, and she warned about its bandwagon effect. Yet, elected and unelected leaders remain indifferent or oblivious to the effect of their unfounded accusations on the media. Not to say that the media doesn't sometimes deserve some of the accusations, but this blanket accusation which tries to take away any criticism directed at them is what's been particularly damaging to the reputation of the free media in many places. It's happening in the US and right across the world, and unless you live, of course, in countries like Norway and Finland or some of the other Scandinavian countries that actually made it onto the top 5 in the World Press Freedom Index this year. But almost everywhere you look otherwise, according to Reporters Without Borders, journalism is either totally blocked or seriously impeded in 73% of the 180s that have been ranked by the organization. That's in more than 130 countries. India, the world's largest democracy, ranked 142 out of 180. China came in at 177th, but the United States wasn't anywhere close to the top 10 or 20. It was 44th on the list. Now, on a personal note, I remember the idealistic reasons I wanted to be a journalist, and I'm going to date myself a little bit, but I will tell you in confidence, it was way, way before the age of social media. I wanted to be a journalist to cover the real issues, to challenge people in positions of authority, institutions of power, toughly, aggressively, but fairly, as the cliche goes, not with an agenda, but from a devil's advocate perspective. Journalism as the fifth estate. Is it still that fifth estate? And if so, for how long? Can it survive social media and, let's be frank, government and corporate visible or not so invisible hands that are often at play? What didn't exist 20, 25 years ago when I started out as a print journalist before moving into television, first as a correspondent for Al Jazeera Arabic and then an anchor here in Washington for Al Jazeera English, now complicates our job. The advent of new technologies, social media, not only complicates honest journalism, it undermines it. But I don't think that any previous generation has grappled with fake news, and I think you'd agree on the scale that we have with the algorithms that only exacerbate the confirmation biases that we all already have as avid news consumers. I remember being on a panel in Doha many years ago, in fact, during the so-called Arab Spring, when social media and Twitter especially was still in its infancy, still in the first early years at the time. Twitter was being, along with other social media platforms, was being glamorized, perhaps rightly so in many respects, for being a liberating medium, for democratizing freedom of speech, for allowing people to retake some control from autocratic governments, especially in the region, to organize and effect change from the bottom up. The events in Tahrir Square, you remember in 2011, the focal point of the uprising against the Mubarak regime were still fresh in our minds. I remember being in the newsroom at Al Jazeera, and there was sheer euphoria. It was a success, many of us believed at the time. I am a reluctant tweeter myself, and back in the day I was still skeptical about social media and its pitfalls, because I believed that it would be a potent tool, sure, in the hands of ordinary citizens who wanted to play that bigger role and have a bigger political say, especially in Middle Eastern countries, where often that bigger political role was restricted to an inner circle of well-connected advisors. But it was also, I felt from back then, a double-edged sword that would be used with far greater efficiency and efficacy by governments, let's face it, who have the resources, who have the wherewithal to use it in a more organized, concerted, strategic way. We often hear about the weaponization of social media. Well, weaponized indeed it is, and quite often by invisible hands, magic wands, as I like to call them. Of course, the traditional media, whether it is free, quote unquote, or state control, isn't perfect either. It isn't neutral, it isn't wholly or objective, even if we like to believe it is. It isn't immune to criticism. In the best case, it is at the nexus of strong political, economic, and financial interests. Most organizations, whether media, print, TV, or radio, have their political leanings, their corporate interests, their bottom lines. And then there are the so-called state-controlled media, which in the worst cases are crude propaganda outlets. We know that. The consumer knows it too. The reader knows it. And so paradoxically, the news consumer is maybe more critical, more astute, more alert in media landscapes that are controlled by governments, ironically, than in countries with a quote-unquote free media, where the media may be free but not necessarily neutral or objective. It can never be, I believe. The mere choice of stories we choose to cover, the way we choose to cover the stories, is a partial, subjective decision. Ladies and gentlemen, it used to be that information is power. Well, today we're at the stage where disinformation is power. So how do you stop this phenomenon? Can we ever go back to the status quo ante? The Secretary General of Reporters Without Borders says that he believes that journalism is, quote, the best vaccine against disinformation. If it is, can we ever get enough people vaccinated? With social media being such a powerful vector of fake news, a source of information for so many people right across the world, the challenge isn't just to stop the virus of lies, as Maria Ressa called it, but to make sure that the fake news bandwagon doesn't get even more crowded and doesn't continue to barrel down what is already a very slippery slope. That is where traditional media organizations and journalists from different parts of the world, like the ones who are here tonight, and who will be honored for their exceptional contributions to journalism, have the additional challenge, as you were saying, Julie, but also the additional responsibility to help pull the brakes. Thank you.